One of our devs just told me the other day that he wrote more code in the last 6 months than he did in 6 years at his last job. He's got 5 Claudes going in 5 different tabs. For AI companies, the issue of cost is a board level issue. There's no doubt that the future is that no humans are writing code anymore. It's all agents writing code.
Thanks for joining the first episode of Terminal Value. Before we jump in, I wanted to introduce myself and set some context on the podcast. My name is Nick Singh. I previously co-founded a company called Center in 2014, focused on the spend management space. We built that company out for 11 years before being acquired by American Express in 2025. The vast majority of my career has been focused in software, predominantly enterprise software. So you can think of Terminal Value as a natural extension of that journey. Terminal Value is a markets deep dive podcast where we focus on how AI and software is reshaping different industries. We'll go deeper than most podcasts though. We'll go into product, go to market, economics, and value capture. And we'll discuss all of that with the founders, operators, and investors reshaping those industries. Today, we'll be covering the cloud cost management space, a market that's become more important because of AI. Inference costs are quickly rising. Cost is no longer just a finance team problem. It's an engineering, a product, and a business model problem. My guest today is Mike Weider, and he's hoping to help solve this problem. He's founder and CEO of a company called Frugal that's raised $5 million to build out what he calls application cost engineering. Today, we'll cover why traditional FinOps dashboards may not be enough, how engineers can understand cost before production, and how this could become a new layer in the software development lifecycle. Now, on to the interview. Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining today. I'm really excited to speak with you.
Yeah, great to be here.
So, Mike, before we jump into Frugal, I'd love to get your perspective on really the platforms that came before you all. And so could you walk through a little bit of context on the legacy cloud cost management players, the FinOps players, and what they offer to the market today?
Sure, yeah. Cloud management tools have been around for almost as long as cloud. And I was actually on the board of one of the original companies, Cloud Checker, that was part of kind of first wave of products created in this area. Ultimately, that product was bought by NetApp, and I think maybe is now owned by Flexera, but Cloudability, Cloud Zero, Cloud Health, there was a bunch of them. And I would say predominantly they sort of were created for the purpose of accounting and visibility. So you had these organizations, groups within an organization, development teams, various ones, kind of all spinning up work on the cloud, Amazon, Azure, GCP, maybe a combination of all those clouds. And you had this accounting issue, which is how do I keep track of these expenses? And how do I allocate those expenses back to departments and just monitor the spend? Because before cloud, if you can remember back then, it was a lot simpler, right? Because I just get approval from finance to buy a bunch of servers. And that was mostly a one-time cost. I buy these things, I know what they're going to cost, and then we deploy them. In the case of cloud, the costs are very variable, right? Where it's dependent upon usage. And the more usage, the more you spend. And so there's this unpredictability of this spend. But also what they made it easy was that in 5 minutes, I could have a new VM or new compute infrastructure set up. And so before finance had all these controls around locking people, knowing what was going to happen because I had to get approval to buy the servers. But as soon as I could just do this with a credit card in 5 minutes, all of a sudden you had all these groups within the organization kind of willy-nilly spinning up things. So the first wave of cloud management was really about getting a viewpoint on that and helping to understand where the spend is happening, how it's trending, and just being able to see what I couldn't see easily through the consoles of the individual cloud providers.
Could you walk us through the high-level workflow of utilizing those tools, and specifically what tension kind of arises through identifying an issue and then ultimately getting that issue ultimately shipped?
So first of all, understand the spend. The second was there's a terminology in the FinOps world, Showback and chargeback. So Showback is the first phase, which is I'm just telling you what you're spending. So before there was the spending happening at a corporate level or centralized level, but all the product teams didn't almost see what was the spend was. So the first phase was now you know, right? Nick, your group is spending $100,000 a month on this various cloud infrastructure. Chargeback is taking that to the next level and saying, I'm not just telling you what you're spending, but I'm actually holding you accountable to that number, and that you have a budget, and whatever you spend is going to get charged back to your product group or your department. And so that's putting a little bit more accountability on all these groups to make sure that they are staying within the bounds of their budgets, and also understanding that they own the costs that are coming. It's not just being absorbed by some amorphous corporate centralized group. And so the tensions really, first of all, was that, most development teams and so forth didn't even see these bills. And so there was no tension because there was just blind spending happening, right? So, the Showback charged that, and Showback kind of fixed that. And then chargeback was the next evolution to hold them accountable to that. And really what that means is that the engineering managers or product teams and so forth are needing to watch these expenses and also control these expenses. And so there's a tension there to keeping within the budgets, but at the same time, hey, I'm trying to serve customers and I'm trying to deliver this feature, and you're slowing me down with all this accounting stuff. Like we have this important customer that we're trying to ship for. And so I think there's a natural tension there of trying to service the business and deliver the value, and at the same time trying to do this in a way that doesn't run off the rails and blow up our budgets.
Could you walk us through ultimately what Frugal is at a high level, and what the new category that you're pioneering, application cost engineering, fundamentally is?
Sure. Yeah. So if you look at how most cost management and optimization is done today, it's extremely reactive. Developers write code. They have no idea the costs of these code changes they're making, whether they're positive or negative. We ship to production, and a month later or some end time later, they show up on the bills, and people examine the bills and react to them, right? And so what we're trying to do is to flip that paradigm and to shift this problem left, as it said, meaning push it upstream, push it earlier in the process. And so the challenge for devs is that it's not like they don't care about costs. It's just hard to know sometimes what things are going to cost you. And they're also, as we said, under this pressure to ship the feature, get things moving and deliver whatever it is that they were setting out to do. And so visibility as you code is a hard problem. So that's problem one we're trying to solve, is try to flag and help developers understand the cost implications of code changes. And we saw this in other markets. In a previous life, we worked on security tools, and it was the exact same thing. Developers would write software, and sometime later in the pipeline, a pen tester would come and do an audit before you went live, tell you all the ways it was broken, kick it back, and the developers would fix that. You'd iterate till it was clean. And then we woke up to say, wouldn't it be smarter if we actually looked at the code as we're writing it? And because it's way easier when I'm in the editor, when I'm coding, to fix it right at the source. And so that's the way most people work today, is that there's some feedback loop, whether it's Sneak or some other tool, to examine your code for security bugs. What we're trying to do is the same thing on cost. So today, developers don't really know what things cost. We're trying to help make that visible. And so when you make a code change, you either, if your AI is writing some code, or if you're as a human, before you go live in production, in GitHub, there's a pull request where a developer is doing the final checks before a feature is merged. We would look at that code and say, is there a cost implication to the code? If yes, then we would flag it for the developer to say, hey, your current spend is X. This code change is going to change it to Y. But if you do these things we recommend, it could be Z, which is hopefully a lower number, right? And so basically it's trying to build cost into how we build software. The second part of what we're doing is we look at the actual production workloads and costs, the live costs. We look at your code. We look at your current bills from AWS, GCP, or Azure, but also what you're spending on Datadog. What are you spending on OpenAI, Anthropic, Mongo, any of these other ancillary services? And then we look at your observability data that tells us how the app is functioning and how different pieces of the code are being exercised. And we build basically a model that allows us to break costs down to the line of code. So right now what happens is that you might get your bill from Amazon that says, hey, Nick, you're spending so much on compute, storage, AI, whatever. But you don't know, well, what specific code or code changes happen to drive these bills up or down, and how do I optimize those? And so we make that clear, but we also are looking into your code for what we call cost traps or inefficient coding patterns, where the developer might have done things in a way that's maybe not perfect from a cost standpoint. Simple example, you're writing some data out that's uncompressed, and by compressing it, you'd reduce 80% of your storage, right? Very simple thing. It's just more telling you about it. The fix is easy. A second example would be you're maybe using more tokens than you need to, and that your API requests or calls out to Anthropic are more verbose than they need to be. And there's things in your prompt that the AI doesn't actually need, but you're paying for because you're putting those in. So you could strip those out and save maybe half of your token costs on this given request. Or it could be your logging costs. We encounter customers all the time that have 6-figure monthly bills to Datadog. Like, the stuff can cost a lot really fast. And maybe their logs are very verbose, or they've got high cardinality metrics. So there's all sorts of different bugaboos that could be done. We're looking in the code, and when we see one of these things, we create a code fix, model the before-after improvement. If it doesn't also cause any problems or downstream effects, we surface to them as a recommendation to optimize. So basically, it's a developer working alongside your developers, either pre-production to tell them not to make a code change that's going to cause a problem, or in production where code changes have already happened and helping you go back and refactor things. And that's the kind of concept for Frugal.
Understood. And so basically there's an interaction at time of development. There's a monitoring component for production workloads sitting on top of the observability stack. And a lot of that is engineering focused. Is there also a scenario where your finance department is also utilizing this product, or there's mainly dev and they're using it as a mechanism to communicate with the finance org?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of two primary parties would be FinOps and development, right? In some organizations, FinOps may sit in finance, in which case there would be an interaction there because they want to understand where there's opportunities to save and then go back to dev and engage them. But increasingly, it's more and more common that FinOps sits within development in some fashion and is already there. But they principally are the folks within an organization that are owning the costs, owning the management of costs for their organization. And so they would be a kind of key stakeholder for sure. And what they're trying to do is get developers to be obviously more frugal, more efficient, more accountable, but they also want visibility, right, to their development teams. But they're wrestling against a problem, which is that devs are busy doing other things and cost is like just a small part of their day, right? And so they're not getting enough cycles out of development. And so what we're trying to do is make that interaction easier by lowering the friction, by doing most of the work that the engineer would have had to have done. So instead of beating on you, Nick, to say, hey, I want you to reduce our Datadog bill by 100K, I'm coming to you with, hey, here are 5 strategies that we've already vetted, and here's the actual code changes. All you have to do is review these and approve them, or reject them, or modify them in some way. But I'm giving you 90% of the work, right? You just need to now react to these things versus starting from scratch, which is a whole ton of work that I probably don't have time for.
That's incredible. You could see the shift over time, where initially you had these companies like Aptio who sold into finance departments. And if what you guys are doing reaches, its ultimate goal, you could see a world where finance spends very little amount of time, talking with the dev team, at least on the cost component, because there's a trusted, vetted source that says, hey, this is as good as it's going to get. So that's powerful. I love the name Frugal, by the way. That is going to be great from a marketing component.
Yeah.
So one of the pieces that you hit on, which I think is so powerful, is this concept of cost to code attribution. How do you drive believability in that automation for the end user? How do you go and build something like that in a way that's trusted?
Yeah, I guess there's two parts of trust. So for the first thing is that in order to work with Frugal, you need to give us access to some sensitive information, your costs, your code, your observability data. And probably the most sensitive one out of the three is really the code, right? In that we need to examine your code. And so, thankfully we have all worked in previous lives in other startups like security startups that looked at code performance optimization. And basically, we've built Frugal from scratch to build a sort of very high security, high trust model. So, in addition to doing all the basic stuff like SOC 2 compliance and pen testing and all that stuff, we have built an architecture that is designed for high security and that every customer is in their own unique secure enclave or tenant. It's not a normal SaaS thing where everybody's intermingled in some very shared database system. And so we've architected this in a way to learn from our past lives about what would make it easier for people to say yes and trust us. And we've built those things in. And as part of every engagement, there's a review by the security team to beat us up about all these questions. And, they'll come away impressed because, of the experience and rigor that we've gone in building this. The second part is kind of maybe where you were getting into, which is how do I trust the output and know that the recommendations we're making are sound and valid? And so, I think that the best part about it is that it's written in code, right? And which is the language of developers. And so we don't just tell you, hey, I think you could save some money by doing X, Y, and Z. What we do is show our work in written language. So we show the logic. We think that there's an opportunity to reduce logging costs because we're seeing X in your system. And by doing this change, which I'm describing in written English, it's going to fix this problem. And here's the math of exactly how it's going to fix it. It's going to reduce your log cost or the number of, size of your log messages by X. Your current bill is this, and so on and so on. It basically tells you everything in English. Then the next part of it is the code. We show you the code. And so you can see a diff basically of here is your current code and here is the modified recommendation code changes that we're making. And then download a patch, which can be integrated into the development environment to actually, enact that. So there's nothing to trust, right? Because they're seeing it there in the code itself. One more thing that we've done is that attached to every account today, there is a human. And so we have an FDE-like model where there's a forward deployed engineer attached to every account. And they have kind of two things they're doing, besides sort of onboarding people. They're vetting the output of Frugal, making sure that it's not, everything is sound, but also the thing that we recognized that maybe we didn't like about past security products was that they can have a tendency to spam you with too much results, right? And then I've got 1,000 security vulnerabilities to look at. And I'm like, oh God, where do I start, right? And so the other job of the FTE is to curate those things and to fold them down into the most salient issues that we think, would have the most impact and make sure they're valid and right. And then work with the client on the implementation of them. So we still have a human in the loop. And, over time that human may back off. But right now, as it's a new system and, AI, as we know, is not infallible, we wanted to have another set of eyes on that to make sure everything that is being produced out of our system is rock solid.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You mentioned Sneak and some of these other systems that will oftentimes give you just a ton of vulnerabilities. I was speaking earlier with an individual, Sean, who's actually started this company, Nullify AI, and they're very focused on how do we not only take that set of vulnerabilities, but actually go deliver a more automated set of fixes to the end customer and tell them what's critical to go address and what's lower priority. And much like you guys are doing, start to really close the loop.
Triaging, yeah,
exactly. I think the concept that of the forward deployed engineer is so fascinating because you answered my next question, which is as models evolve, how much of these types of products are subsumed by the model itself. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like even as models evolve, there's still this layer of curation that is absolutely critical at the use case level in order to deliver a best of breed product. But how do you see this?
Yeah, I think that's real. And maybe as we say over time, the human element lessens or diverts to other places. But still, we're seeing today that it is important, obviously, to have another set of eyes on things. That AI can produce some incredible outputs, but it sometimes produces incredibly wrong outputs, right? And so we need to have a system to plan for that. I think the other thing is that AI is as good as the context that it's given. And it's kind of like a human. It's not that much different. If I ask you to go perform a task, but I give you only a quarter of the information you need to perform that task, you're gonna maybe do the best you can with what you have, but you have an incomplete input to perform the task at hand. AI is the exact same thing, right? So today, AI systems have access to code, but they don't see the bills. They don't have access to the observability systems. And even if they did, they're not good at processing that data because they just don't deal with petabytes of log files very well. And it would be stupidly expensive for them to do that, right? In that the token cost would be probably will cost you more than it's worth. And so in addition to using AI, we have built a whole set of deterministic tools which process logs, do other queries, like things that are just regular code that are summarizing, synthesizing, etc., with the whole goal for how do we assemble the most compact but relevant bit of context to power an AI system to make a good decision.
Where have you found uh, customers receive the most value? Do you see it at the smaller customers who are more open to changing their practices, or do you feel that there's a certain amount of cloud cost that's necessary for your ROI story to really hit home?
We started out working with other startups just because it was within our network and easier to get access to, and they were, more willing to work with a new company. But we're increasingly sort of moving upstream, and I would say, if I'm in super growth mode, I'm growing 100% year over year. I may not be as focused on cost as someone who is a little more mature. And so, and also, if I'm only spending, I don't know, 10 grand a month on my cloud bills, it's obviously less impact that we can have on your business than someone who's spending $1 million a month or $10 million a month, right? And so our kind of ICP are today companies that are spending 10 million and up in cloud costs. And so, what that kind of presupposes is usually it's about 10% of their ARR, right? So you're talking about, companies that are somewhere around 50 to 100 million in revenue type of thing and up. And then, we're looking at that sort of other tech companies in the sort of 50 to 500 million range, and we will move up after that. But the bigger they are, the slower typically they are, and the more hurdles and gates and things that they're going to just move at a slower pace. And so it kind of makes sense to, work with some folks that are a little more nimble, but still have a need and that they're spending enough that this is important. I think what's also changing though is that AI native companies are an interesting phenomenon because what we're seeing at Frugal is that our AI costs to run Frugal are way higher than our traditional cloud costs. And I think that that's going to be true for a lot of companies now moving forward. And the other thing that's different is that the variable cost or cost per customer of usage is actually material. Whereas if you're, I don't know, Shopify or Salesforce, like adding a new customer is almost free, right? It doesn't move the needle. But for AI companies, it really could be material. And so the issue of cost is a board level issue that is material to the fundamental business model and economics, unit economics of an AI company in a way that it maybe wasn't as much for previous gen companies. And so I think that the problem of cost management is painful for everybody today, but it's kind of existential for someone who is building AI native software.
Here's one question I've just selfishly been very interested in from an overall market standpoint. At what point do you, Mike, as the leader of a company, not need to move the majority of your LLM calls to the frontier model and really start to control your own gross margin profile? Do you see that in the near term, or is it such a huge impact to your own product that you have to kind of move to the latest frontier model?
Yeah, it depends what you're doing. And so, what we're doing is looking at code. And so we work with Claude Code behind the scenes. Like our developers write things using Claude Code, but I'm talking about our product actually uses Claude Code to perform actions on the code of our clients, right? And so you can use, Opus, Sonnet, Haiku, each of which have a different price per token model. And so the question is, which model is good enough to get the job done that you want to do? And so the answer to that is a difficult challenge for companies, right? Because you need to examine the output and to understand whether if I degrade the model to go for a cheaper one, is it still able to actually get the job done in an adequate level? And, and maybe another question is, do I need to actually use a model at all? And that the AIs will code things and sometimes they'll use AI to do some function that actually deterministic code could actually do better and more reliably, but most importantly, cheaper. And so the challenge for, companies embedding AI in their software is understanding where's the most bang for the buck in terms of the model that I need to use. And do I even need to use AI in this period, or could I use some other deterministic code that wouldn't cost me tokens? And the key to this is having what people call evals, which is a fancy word for validation or QA on the outputs, right? But you need some loop that's able to tell you if I change the model and I'm getting a different output for some way to understand whether that output is good enough or passing or failing. And it sounds simple, but in some cases is a very tough problem. Let's say, for example, on this podcast, you've got something transcribing the audio, right? And one expensive model produces a transcript, and then you could downgrade it to a lesser model and produces a different transcript. Well, you've got to read those things and understand which is good, or is it good enough, the cheaper one or not, right? It's kind of subjective, right? And so it's about getting as objective as you possibly can in those loops, such that you could have a repeatable thing. So that's kind of one optimization, that is a challenging one to do. A simpler one to do is just use less tokens, right? Because what we find is people will, by default, maybe use more tokens than they need to be, or maybe not using token caching or other things that could reduce costs. And that doesn't matter which model you're using, they're all going to save, because your cost is your cost per token multiplied by how many tokens, right? So I can either try and reduce the price of the tokens I'm using, or I can reduce how many tokens period I'm using.
How do you think about pricing your own product in the market? There's obviously been a huge shift in SaaS companies getting pushed to move to more of a utilization type of model to pass that cost structure that you just spoke about onto their customers. And I've talked to a lot of founders and they've said, hey, my customer wants predictability in their model in some way, shape, or form. And so I'd love to get your take on what you're doing at Frugal to address that push and pull.
Yeah, it's a great question and challenge. I'd say there's a couple parameters to think about, right? There's how do I align pricing with value that I'm delivering, so customers think that that's a fair amount that scales well with the value delivered. A small customer getting small value pays less than a big customer paying large value. There's predictability in that, as you say, people don't want surprises. So how do you bake predictability out of this? And then maybe the third thing to consider is cost alignment, in that I could do those other two things, but maybe it's not aligned with my costs, in that as the usage could grow and all of a sudden my margins go down because I haven't levered that into the system. And so I think people are dealing with AI and challenges on all those fronts. A lot of people are trying to come up with outcome-based pricing, which perfectly deals with the first point, which is delivering value for the customer. Customer gets value, you get paid. Whereas in the past, sometimes you pay regardless of whether value is delivered, right? But then that has implications for predictability, in that, hey, you could all of a sudden have some runaway great results for me, and maybe I'm okay with it because that scales with the value I'm getting, and I don't mind the cost going up. But most people, what I've observed is that enterprises, especially bigger companies, would rather pay more and have a predictable price then, risk on paying less on the upfront, but they would have some unpredictable outcome, right? Then all of a sudden things could spike away from them. And so what they want is some caps on things, and that it can't get worse than X. And then the last point is really aligning with your costs, right? And that, as we said, in SaaS, it didn't really matter because the variable cost was almost zero. But now it matters. And so when we look at us, for example, our costs go up with how much code we look at. Code is tokens. Tokens cost us money. And so our cost per run or scan of a customer's environment is material. And so it's important for us to have a model which protects us in a way that we don't have some runaway usage that is all of a sudden going to mean we're underwater, with every customer. And so there's this triangle of those three things: the alignment of value, the predictability, and the alignment of your cost model. And I think every company needs to consider those three things and how to balance them as well as they possibly can. But sometimes there are gives and takes on them that may conflict.
I'd love to get your take on how you see your own product offering changing the engineering org structure, if at all. And then I'd love to ask you next around kind of how you think about your own org structure at Frugal.
Yeah. I mean, I think, for us, in terms of how we change org structures of customers, we're kind of maybe a little different in the sense that we're automating a problem people aren't doing well today. So we're not necessarily getting rid of a bunch of engineers with Frugal. They're not doing this. And it's because it was too much work, right? So this is an example of AI creating a new solving a problem that was probably unsolvable before. It was just too much effort. And so it didn't get done. And now it's possible with AI because we can look at, this code in an automated way. I think on the side of how we run our business and how we're executing, I think, things are obviously very different. And probably the biggest change and eye opener, as you see, is how we build Frugal, how we build the engineers are using. That's the vanguard, right? Like the coding agents and the evolution of these tools, as everybody knows, is probably at the frontier of AI usage. And, what I see is that one of our devs just told me the other day that he wrote more code in the last 6 months than he did in 6 years at his last job. Like that just, they've got 5 Claudes going in 5 different tabs. One is doing planning on a new feature, one is testing an existing feature, one is kind of in the middle of coding, and he's, directing it to say, oh, stop, don't do that, do this. So an engineer is becoming a conductor or manager of multiple agents. And good engineers know how to multitask, to have many agents working in parallel to get jobs done in a much more productive and efficient way. That's kind of one thing. But the second is that I think what people are discovering is that you can't just kind of code and create software in the old way that you did things, because AI is good at some things and bad at others. And like, for example, the bigger the context window, the bigger the input of the task, and the more vague a task you're giving it, the worse a job it does, and vice versa. So the more narrow and bounded the problem is, the better it does. And so you have to be good at giving it these bite-sized problems. It also requires context. And so you're constantly investing in documentation, not for humans, but for other Claudes, right? And so there's a huge investment of that. We've also re-architected our entire, or architected this entire code factory, that we're using to build Frugal in a way that is designed to harness agents in a very productive way. Whereas in the past, we've kind of designed these for humans with sprints and these human review processes, everything works differently, right? And so I think sometimes engineers or people will look at these tools and they'll, use them to sort of replicate their workflow of the past and say, it doesn't do it as well as I did it before. This stuff is crap. I don't know what everybody's talking about. This is hype, and you realize that you actually have to change how you work as well. And in order to get the most value out of these things. So I think what we're seeing in engineering probably is going to translate into other functions, whether it's sales, whether it's marketing, whether it's finance and so forth. They're just not as evolved because coding was sort of the perfect fit with AI and the most advanced. But I think you're going to see this structure of people being the conductor of many agents and having to modify their workflows and how they work. That I think is going to translate into all of our job functions.
I'd love to get your take on some of the adjacent players. Your category is interesting in that it's not as simple as you have one system of record and then you build on top of it. Like some other companies I've talked to where it's like, hey, the CRM is the system of record and I'm building an agent workflow on top of it for outreach. You sit on top of the code repos and editors in a sense. You sit on top of the cloud billing and telemetry, potentially work with the FinOps platform. Can you help me square how all those players work together and how your agentic platform works with them?
So there's essentially three inputs, right? We need access to the code, which is typically GitHub. We need access to your costs, which is often in your hyperscaler as a big chunk of it, but there's often many ancillary kind of other costs to third parties that we need to aggregate and bring in. And then the last part is the telemetry of how the system is running. And increasingly, there's other sources of data that we are scooping up and bringing. And again, with the objective of trying to provide more context and synthesis such that we can then engage AI to solve problems and give them the information they need to make good decisions. And so part of what Frugal is doing is that we're basically generating context for AI to make good coding decisions around costs and efficiency by pulling in data from many sources, synthesizing it into this broader intelligence system about your cost and your code and how the system is running, and then enabling other these agents basically to leverage that data in a way that they couldn't just by themselves by looking at the code or whatever they had access to. And so we're not necessarily disrupting or getting rid of any of those things. So I think Gen 1 of FinOps tooling, for example, which was dashboards, accounting, all that kind of stuff, you still need that. Everybody needs measurement. The second thing, that those tools are good for is that most of the optimization work that people have done is what you call rate optimization. And that's a fancy word for saying, I'll commit to you, Amazon, for 2 years of spending at this run rate, and you'll give me 10 or 15 points discount. And so I'm not actually reducing my usage, but they're giving me a discount if I sign up for some time period. And so some of those tools are good at helping you predict kind of what your usage is going to trend like and look like of your costs, your run rate costs, to inform those negotiations with those vendors. I think none of that stuff goes away. The part that we're doing is really additive and different, which is engaging the engineers to actually perform optimization of the actual code. So we're not trying to reduce the price you pay or the rate per gigabyte or rate per token. We're trying to reduce the actual tokens or the actual consumption, make the code more efficient without impacting the functionality or causing problems. And so I think it's additive to the overall story. Gen 1 of FinOps is going to help you measure stuff. Frugal is going to help you fix stuff and be the tool. We're kind of more FinOps for engineering than we are FinOps for finance people.
Yeah, that makes sense. When we were building out Center, occasionally we would get questions from investors, customers around, hey, you're building on top of the ERP. Why doesn't the ERP just build it? And we would try and tell them like, hey, it's just not their focus area. There's so many other things they have to go do. We ended up getting more competition from adjacent industries. But as you think about all of those players that you just talked about, from the editors and agent coders, the FinOps players, the hyperscalers who probably don't have an incentive to reduce costs that much, where do you see competition, if at all, long term?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible that some of the dashboard or measurement FinOps tools kind of get into engineering, but it is an entirely different world. Like there's nothing that they have that's going to be useful to helping them do this. Like it's brand new. So I think that's maybe less of a threat. I think the other adjacencies could be from the Datadogs or code observability tools of the world. They're playing around these areas Again, they don't really get into cost estimation of code, but they're playing it around observability and understanding a system and how it's working. And I think increasingly you're seeing the next gen of observability tools like Resolve and these other new vendors that are all about taking action. And so it's not just about pointing out a problem like you had an alert in your production system. It's doing root cause analysis to try and figure out what caused that. And so I think this is where AI is changing a lot of these systems, is that before, you would stop at the reporting of an issue. Now the expectation is, no, keep going. Help me understand why that thing is broken. Kind of like your security example. Like, don't just tell me I got a vulnerability. Tell me if it's exploitable and create a patch, right? Take it to the last mile. So potentially some competition there. There's always the threat of the cloud codes and these other tools absorbing cost. And so we need to make sure that we're obviously adding more value than you can get just by using them by default.
What is the workflow or the vision that Frugal is embedding on the market, a handful of years down the road?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the future is that no humans are writing code anymore. It's all, agents writing code. And so it would behoove us to get good at helping agents write better code, rather than have them write a bunch of code that's then spits out an output to the humans and then we flag the cost issues that the humans need to fix. The ultimate end game here is that Frugal empowers Claude or GitHub Copilot or Cursor to write the most efficient code possible right from default. And then we still need to look at the production systems, because even if I do the best job today in writing efficient and the most efficient app that's possible, is that 6 months from now that the choices I made may not be the right choices anymore, right? And that the usage pattern of my application may have changed, or there's some new technology. And so you need to be doing both. But ultimately, I think, a big value is build cost into how we write software from the get-go. And today that doesn't happen. And it is plainly obvious to me that this will be true in the future. Every bit of code is going to be reviewed for efficiency, like it is for security, quality, reliability, other non-functional requirements. That is definitely going to happen, and it's going to be forced on us because the variable cost of our code is going to be that much more important.
Yeah, Mike, this was incredible. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you.
Great talking to you, Nick.
That was a really interesting conversation with Mike. A few things stood out for me in this. The first is that as AI starts to generate more and more code, it's going to be critical to have a countervailing force that is able to automatically check the cost structure of that code. So you're not delivering slop into production and destroying your gross margins. Second, today was another good reminder that context is a defensible position in the applied AI market. I pressured Mike a little bit on why can't Anthropic or OpenAI go do this themselves? And his point was, it's not just enough to sit on the code repository. You also have to build integrations around the observability stack and the cloud billing stack to help you determine where you need to reduce costs and how you go about doing that. And so it's just another reminder that a good applied AI company is going to be one that really has a defensible context and a great deployment process to build that context. And lastly, and a more optimistic point is, I think a lot of podcasts and folks talk about the negative job implications of AI, and they don't spend enough time talking about the new categories that get created. For example, like this one, where Mike is creating jobs along with the category. And there are many, many founders out there like Mike who will be creating jobs that couldn't exist without the benefit of AI. And so just a good note to end on. And thank you for watching Terminal Value. Tune in next week.